Hello, my name is Mike Gears and this is my project on tourism and disaster. To begin, I'm going to give a very broad definition of natural disaster and tourism. A natural disaster is a natural event with catastrophic consequences for living things in the vicinity. Now, tourism is probably even broader, all temporary visits to another region or country lasting more than 24 hours. A natural disaster can be anything from a hurricane to a flood, a tsunami, or an earthquake, such things like that. And a natural disaster normally has negative consequences on the area that it affects, and that's mainly in the aspect of tourism. Now, whenever a natural disaster occurs, then there is normally a decline in the number of tourists visiting the area after the disaster occurs because obviously the place is destroyed and there's nothing else that it can do. And because there's a decrease in tourists, there's a decrease in the money being spent in the area and a lack of visitors due to the decrease in the general economy. And that causes businesses to suffer, that causes closing of businesses, and larger businesses begin to decline. And unemployment is also affected by a natural disaster because it lowers the disposable income that people are able to spend. Also, government spending decreases due to a lack of revenue. Now I'm going to give a positive example of where a natural disaster increased tourism. This example is occurring in the small Cornish village of Boscastle. This village experienced one of the worst flash floods in its history on August 14th, 2004. After the flood hit, Boscastle was subject to a lot of media attention, which increased public knowledge of Boscastle and increased the tourism interest in Boscastle. Now, it wasn't until a couple years later where Boscastle spent £800,000 on flood-proofing the city to prepare for a new flood or something to happen like that. And the same year, they had another flood that is similar to the flood on August 14th, 2004, and only 2 to 3 houses had small amounts of damage. Now this really helped the city because tourists wanted to were flocking there and coming there, and they didn't even have enough places for all the tourists to stay. Now another example that is a negative effect on the tourism to a country, it happened in southeastern Thailand, and it was called the Boxing Day tsunami, which happened in 2004. This was another example where a natural disaster had a massive impact on tourism, but in this case it was more negative. This is because the tsunami decimated Thailand, destroying most buildings and even landscapes. This disaster was so massive that they didn't even have any buildings for tourists to even come and stay, so they were really receiving money to help them rebuild and save lives from the aftermath of the tsunami. And this really created a negative image towards the area of Thailand because people just thought it wasn't safe because all the media attention was so negative and showed all this death and destruction. So it was really hard for them to create an image that would allow tourists to come back and really want to be there. Now, a common challenge is resurrecting tourism after natural disasters, and the common challenge which binds the recovery of these nations involves restoring confidence in their key source markets or just the positive interest of tourism towards that new nation. And familiarization, which is visits by the media and other significant shapers of opinion, which would be like tourists or maybe travel agents, just to see how the country is recovering. And this is a small part of tourism recovery for the media aspect because the media tends to point out more negative uh, aspects of recovery and doesn't really point out any positives most of the time. And this can be hard, but Japan sought to revitalize their international tourism by inviting 10,000 tourists and paying $10 million to accept free airline tickets to Japan. And this was kind of crazy for them to do that, but it somehow worked and increased in interest in the tourism to Japan. But they may have not received a profit, but it definitely did increase the tourists and people wanting to go there and check Japan out. In conclusion, natural disasters and tourism go hand in hand. Natural disasters initially decrease tourism to a country, but then as the country rebuilds itself, tourism may increase because of the increased notoriety and media attention. So as countries rely heavily on tourism, there is a need for countries to rebuild quickly, regenerate their trade, and deal with the disasters in order to survive. Yet, for larger industrialized nations, they may find it harder to restore their economy due to their reliance on the industry for their economy, where they're located, and what disaster actually hits. And therefore, disaster and tourism can occur simultaneously and pose problem specific, but with a good emergency plan and preparation, it makes it easier to rebuild and survive.